dear patrons, and welcome to the first installment of our course on the knitted crazy quilt. In this series, we'll be using one of the most famous forms of patchwork sewing as the basis for knitting projects that have the potential to be useful, beautiful, and fascinating to make. Let's take a brief look, first of all, at crazy quilting itself, what it is, and where it came from. Now, I used to think that crazy quilting, like some other forms of patchwork, was a product of pure necessity. Of course, before the modern industrial era, fabric was expensive and precious, and whenever possible, it needed to be transformed or reused rather than thrown out. What had been a man's shirt might become a boy's shirt, then a handkerchief, and then finally a rag. And even that rag might have value and could be sold to a rag dealer. This point of view persisted in my own native corner of Pennsylvania well into my childhood. My grandmother was fond of saying that when she was a girl, a piece of fabric that came into the house didn't leave until there was nothing left of it. And when I was a boy, the making of braided rag rugs from old clothing was still extremely common. Crazy quilting, however, was born less out of a desire for thrift than a desire for self-expression. True, it most often did make use of scraps and cast-offs, that's certain. However, the style and the impulse behind it were more artistic and idealistic than purely practical. You see, the mania for crazy patchwork arose in the late 1870s, in tandem with two other widespread trends. The first was the aesthetic movement, spearheaded by designers like William Morris and Christopher Dresser, and philosophers like Oscar Wilde. They believed, in brief, that ordinary domestic life should be beautiful, and that even humble, useful things within a home ought to be little works of art. The second trend was an American and European interest, an interest amounting to a craze, in the decorative arts of Japan. Fans, screens, woodblock prints, ceramics, and of course, needlework and textiles. The earliest articles on crazy patchwork indeed often refer to it as Japanese or Oriental patch. It seems to have been a response to both the desire to imitate, without necessarily understanding, the look of Asian textiles, and the desire to create useful art for the home. Indeed, one recommended place to display your finished crazy quilt was in a Turkish corner, that being a nook or small room stuffed with wildly patterned curtains and cushions and all manner of exotic bric-a-brac meant to emulate the voluptuous appearance of a Turkish or Middle Eastern harem, or at least the completely fictional version of the harem as imagined and depicted by European artists. Now, the stuff in your Turkish corner did not need to be Turkish, it only needed to look Eastern. Eastern being a category into which the American and European mind of the time lumped pretty much everything from Africa to Polynesia. Tellingly, crazy patchwork was also often characterized as artistic patchwork, by definition as creative as it was utilitarian. From the start, the point was not merely to put old fabrics to new uses, but for the maker to express herself in the process of the making. There were techniques and guidelines, but no rules and no limits. In fact, you didn't need to use the technique to make a quilt at all. You could make anything, truly, from pillows, like this one in the collection of Colonial Williamsburg, to this tea cozy that allowed for a wild amount of creativity in a small space. Now, our knitted crazy quilts will evoke the look of the sewn patchwork, but of course we'll be using yarn instead of fabric. Although, for a splendid finish, we will sew on a woven fabric lining. In addition to imitating the patches, we will also dive into one of the most beautiful aspects of the form, the decorative embroidered seams. As these patterns from Weldon's Practical Needlework, an 1880s publication, show, It was these seams that were often the real showstopper. Now, I will admit, it was the need to use up some precious odds and ends of yarn that inspired my first crazy knitting, and that's also what has inspired this course. Like many of you, I have issues when it comes to yarn hoarding. It's not just the constant buying of new yarn that's the problem. It's the difficulty of letting go of old yarn, even when it's only scraps. Behind me, you see a little pile of partial balls of a particularly lovely, luxurious brand. There's not enough of any one color to make even a pair of mittens, and I'm not going to wear one of those sweaters that's made of stripes of every color thrown in at random, just because it's not my style. But something must be done with this yarn. I previously attempted to use it up in a crocheted lap blanket, this one, and I'm very happy with the outcome, but still it left me with hundreds of miles of stuff still on the shelf and in the cupboards and in the boxes. So I'm going to begin a new knitted crazy quilt, the largest I've ever done, and I'm bringing you along with me, showing you each step of the process. All you'll need to begin will be yarn and needles, and happily, I doubt you'll need to go out and buy either. Use whatever's handy. Look in your stash of odds and ends. My pile is a mix of worsted, DK, sport, and fingering, and it can all be used. We'll certainly talk about that. And I'll be knitting it on needles of a size that will give me a nice, firm garter stitch in the heaviest weight yarn that I plan to use. By firm, I mean a garter stitch in which the ridges of the fabric end up nice and snug, right up against one another, as you see here. What that size will be for you will depend upon your personal gauge. Pick out a yarn that you'd like to put into your quilt, cast on 30 stitches or so, and, working flat, knit all stitches in all rows for several inches to see what you get. If your fabric seems loose, try smaller needles. If it's so tight that the knitting process is unpleasant, try larger needles. When in doubt, see what you get knitting with needles that are about the same thickness as your yarn. This often works for me. We'll be knitting flat, so your needles can be straights or circulars. It's up to you. You don't have to decide on the scope of your project now, or worry about having enough yarn to finish it. 3 different colors will be plenty to play with, and possibilities will begin to suggest themselves as you proceed. So, gather your supplies, and I'll look forward to seeing you here again soon so that we can cast on our first blocks. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being a patron.